When we hear the term Notre Dame as opposed to Notre Dame, what we almost automatically think of is the Cathedral of Paris. We simply call it Notre Dame. But as I've already pointed out, and we'll see again and again and again, there are many cathedrals in France, in fact, most of the ones we're going to look at in detail, dedicated to Our Lady, that is to say, the Virgin Mary. So we really properly should say Notre Dame de Paris, just as we should say Notre Dame de Chartres, or Notre Dame de Lens, or Notre Dame de Reims, or whatever it might be. But nevertheless, it's clearly ingrained in our mind that Notre Dame, first and foremost, is a reference to Paris. Now, it's also obvious that Notre Dame means a lot of things other than a 12th century Gothic cathedral. We have all kinds of images in our mind from later times. Perhaps the most famous one is from the book and then the great movie, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And we have a picture here, a still from an early version of that movie, and that's sort of how we imagine Notre Dame, the hunchback up in the tower with the gargoyles and whatever. And that's all fine and dandy and legitimate. After all, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is an important novel and an important film. We, however, having said this, are going to ignore all that, and we're going to look at Notre Dame in its 12th century context. But even in the 12th century, when the cathedral was built, it was special. And let me suggest some reasons why. First of all, obviously, Paris is the capital of France. Now, capital is a little bit later term, really, but clearly it was the political and administrative center of France and became more so over the course of the Middle Ages. And so it is special in that way. It's marked as being special in that way by the fact that if we look at Notre Dame, it is on an island in the Seine, the Ile de la Cité, and one of the things that it shared on the island was the space dedicated to the palace of the King of France. Now, today, only small parts of that palace survive, and a 13th century royal chapel survives, Sainte-Chapelle, which we'll look at a little bit later on. So obviously, this island in the 21st century looks different than it did in the 12th or 13th. It was dominated by the two great figures, the Bishop of Paris and the King of France. And they lived almost, not quite, but almost across the street from each other. It's fair to say metaphorically, if not quite literally, that the Cathedral of Notre Dame was in the shadow of the royal palace and vice versa. It's also clear because of that in some ways the history of France and the history of the Cathedral of Notre Dame are entwined in a way the political history of France is entwined with almost no other building, except perhaps for the Cathedral of Reims, because that's where the kings were crowned. It's also important to say there's something else special about Paris. At the very time that Notre Dame was being built, it was the time of the flourishing of the Cathedral School of Paris, one of the great intellectual centers of the 12th century. It's a place, for example, where the great philosopher Peter Abelard taught. And in fact, by about 1200, parts of that cathedral school had become kind of quasi-independent of the cathedral, moved over to the left bank of the Seine, and became the University of Paris, the most important university of the Middle Ages. So Paris was an extraordinarily important intellectual center. Thomas Aquinas, for example, was a professor in the 13th century at the University of Paris. And it's also worth mentioning that Paris is extraordinarily important in the history of music, because the music of the early Christian centuries was monophonic. Everybody sang the same notes at the same time, Gregorian chant. It was really more than any place else in the Cathedral of Paris that there were experiments with polyphonic music, people singing different notes at the same time, harmony. And so for many things, intellectually and musically and politically and architecturally, Notre Dame is a very important place.